You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 91, Speaking Basque and Spanish. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. This is episode 91, and we are officially 9 episodes away from episode 100. This week, my guest Esther joins me to talk about her languages of Basque and Spanish. Esther talks to us about growing up with Spanish as her first language in the United States. She shares her connections to her Basque heritage through her parents and how the heritage was a part of her upbringing. She tells us about the Basque communities in the Western U.S. and how she started on her journey to learning the language and eventually to teaching it. Esther tells us some wonderful stories on the people and experiences she encountered as she was learning the Basque language. And for those of you who are learning Basque or curious about how to speak it, Esther is sharing a few helpful tips that will help you to understand the language. Big thank you to Esther for sharing parts of your languages and heritage with all of us. If you enjoy this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Esther. How are you today, Esther?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And yourself?
I'm fantastic. I'm so happy that we finally have a chance to sit down and talk. And as I was saying before, I feel like we already know each other from years of following each other on social media. So I'm so happy that we have this opportunity to have a real conversation.
Yeah. It's one of those where we have our virtual friends and then you talk via text or audio messages, but we never get to do this in person and see each other.
Yeah.
So it's great. Yeah.
I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Okay. My first language is Spanish. I learned English when I was 5, when I went to kindergarten. Then I started learning Basque officially in 2010. Started learning French in 2014, 2015. And then this year, in the spring of this year, in 2021, I started learning Russian.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a departure. How's that going so far?
Really slow.
Yeah.
But I give about 5 minutes a day. So it's going to be a slow moving process. So I accept it, and I'm content learning the alphabet, a couple words, but it's the alphabet because it's completely different than any other language I've ever studied. So,
right. Yeah. Oh, that'll be fun. That sounds like a nice adventure to have.
But like you said, whoa.
Yeah.
Completely different.
So your first language is Spanish and you started learning English when you went to school. Where did Basque kind of come into this mix at all? Or is there a heritage connection that you have through your family to the Basque language? And I'm making a big assumption here because I know that Basque is spoken in part of Spain. I know it's an autonomous region. I'm really not up on my geopolitical borders of Spain, but can you tell us some more about that?
Yeah. So my parents immigrated to the United States and they immigrated in the late 60s, separate. They ended up meeting in the States. But in the time period here, it was still in a dictatorship. So many Basques, even though they left after the Spanish Civil War, which was earlier in the 1900s, they went to Argentina, to the United States. During the dictatorship, as we know, many countries, what do people do in a dictatorship? They leave. They look for better things, how to survive, maybe the land of opportunity, which for many here was the United States, the American dream. And so my dad, he started working when he was 14 years old outside the house. He was the oldest of 6 siblings. And the opportunity came, and that would take him to the United States on a contract to work in a cattle farm, in a feedlot. And then my mom, she would end up going later because she had uncles that had already gone over there. And she went once to visit them. And she was like, I'm never going back. She didn't like it. But then the story goes on. One of her uncles ended up losing his wife and a child in labor. And he had 2 little girls. So he lost his son, his wife. And now how's he going to raise his 2 little girls alone? So they asked my mom to go over there. And my mom was like, no. Well, she ends up going. My parents meet, they get married. And then I'm born over there as well, my brother. So that's how we ended up in the States. And everyone else is still in Navarra, which is one of the historical 7 provinces of the Basque Country.
Okay.
And that's how that comes into play. Well, during the dictatorship, you probably heard the Basque language was, they tried to squash it down. Franco really tried to not only get rid of people by bombing Guernica, but you could be in prison for speaking the language. When they were in school, my parents, they were punished for speaking the language. So what happened? Families they maintained the Basque or they stopped using it for fear. And my mom, on her side of the family, my grandpa, he had spent a lot of time in jail during this time period. And so when he was out, my mom was a little girl. He was like, we're not going to speak Basque, even though her parents did speak Basque. She was the youngest of siblings and she never was taught. Whereas on my dad's side, he's the oldest sibling and he did use Basque at home as well as his siblings. And then when he left the home, he used Basque wherever he was working as well. So when they got together, there's one language in common, which was Spanish. Yep. And so in the household, in Euskera, we always say, what's your first language? It's actually, what's your amaren hezkuntza? Ama is mom. Ren, the declination is the apostrophe S, and hezkuntza is language. So we always ask, what's your mother tongue? But mother tongue, also like, what is the language of your mom? And I think it really is important. What does the mother speak? Because she's the one who tends to spend the most time with the children.
Right.
My mom spoke Spanish. My dad did speak both, but we use Spanish in the home.
Okay.
So that's how I learned Spanish. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Did you have anything let me just take a step back. Let us know where in the U.S. you grew up.
Okay. My parents immigrated to Washington State, both of them, even though they went separate. That's where they ended up. And they got married there. When I was a little girl, they did end up going to Chino, California to work in a dairy with other Basques, but they did return back to Washington to go farm there. So I was born and raised in Moses Lake, Washington.
Okay.
And you asked earlier about where does the Basque language come in? As a little girl, I would hear my dad speaking it. When we would get together for Basque festivals or with other Basques, I'd hear that other language. And you know what, little kids, hey, why do you speak that language? I want to speak that language. I want that language. The kids want what their dad or their mom or dad have. And I'd hear him on the phone with his family here. I want that language. But my dad always said, in this country, meaning the United States, you need 2 languages. And with 2 languages, you'll have whatever you want, which was Spanish and English. Yeah. And it's true. It's so true.
That's very interesting. And I the reason why I asked where you grew up and, to let us know where you grew up is because I was wondering where there was the Basque community in the United States. So is it that part of California? You said Chino or Chico?
Yeah. Chino,
California. Is there even a Chico?
Yeah.
I don't even know.
There is. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a Chico State University or something.
There is. Yeah. I'm such an East Coaster. I don't even know like California cities. But so you said Chino, And you said Moses
Moses
Lake
Lake.
in
Mm-hmm.
Washington. So are there Basque communities in those areas?
Yeah. So in Moses Lake, there are a few Basque families. There are also that are first generation like ourselves. Then what I discovered when I was a teacher there in my hometown, there's a lot of people with Basque last names. And they might have one parent or a grandparent that was from the Basque Country. So that was always fascinating to me. Or they are of Mexican descent. And because of, the Spanish coming over, the Basque coming over long time ago into Mexico, you have Basque last names, and they have also immigrated to the States. And there's the Basque last names through the history.
Right.
So in Moses Lake, we have a few people. And then we also have a lot of Spaniards from other areas, like from Aragon, Galicia. I'm trying to think, Madrid. And then as far as a Basque community in Washington State, we're scattered. So we do have a Basque house, which is called Euskera.
Mm-hmm.
And we get together and celebrate, but it's moving. Like we either have it in Seattle or in Yakima, and we pick a site. But you go down into Idaho, and now you're going to go near Boise, and you've got over 5,000 Basques that are documented. And it's from the province of Vizcaya.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
And not all from this time period. No, it's from the 1800s, 1900, early 1900s, and through the dictatorship. So that's in the Boise area and all the surrounding area. Then you go into Oregon. There's a couple parts there like Jordan Valley that have some Basque influence. Nevada as well. Elko, Reno. I'm trying to think of other places. I know there's others. Winnemucca. They all have influence of the Basque restaurants. You go into California and you've got several areas from Northern California, like Rockland, San Francisco, in the Bay Area, there's several. You go down Bakersfield, Chino, and those are all the different areas. And then throughout the U.S., even in New York, there's a Basque Euskera, but it's not like what you would see as far as a big building like we have in San Francisco or in Boise.
I want to ask you, as far as being a Spanish speaker in the U.S. and having parents that were from Europe. In the U.S., a lot of the Spanish that's spoken here is from the Americas, either people from the Americas, let's say.
Yep.
Was there any, or had you noticed any type of distance between, I guess, the language itself? Maybe let's just talk about the language itself. Communicating in the Spanish language with people who maybe were from Latin America or from the Americas, like as you're speaking the language, as you're communicating, did you notice, or had you noticed any type of like, oh, this is a different way of saying certain things, or a different way of navigating through this language because you had European Spanish?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I could see where you're going with focusing on the language. In Moses Lake, where I'm from, we have a large population for people from Mexico. So one of the things that I noticed growing up is my parents, their first language is Spanish, English, well, Basque Spanish for my dad, but Spanish, we'll stick with Spanish. So for them to speak in English, it's always been more difficult. It's not the easiest. So for them to speak to Spanish people, it's always been easy. They have no problem with it. And speaking Spanish with others from around the world, it's like speaking, like you and I speaking, you're from New York, I'm West Coast, you're East Coast. We're going to have our different nuances in the language, or let's talk to the Brits or to the Irish. So you're always going to have different words. And so there wasn't a lack of communication. What I always found fascinating with my dad, especially not my mom, because she doesn't do this, but my dad, whoever he spoke to, he would change his accent to talk to them. So we have some Chilenos in our area also that are from Chile, and he'd start to speak to them. And it's always cool because then when he'd come home and he'd be like, do you know how to say this word in Spanish? And I'm like, yeah, I'd say, for example, alubias. He's like, not for the Chilenos. And I'm like, well, what do they say? And he'd say porotos. I think it was porotos. And I'd be like, oh, I go, oh, well, the Mexicanos, they say frijoles. And he's like, yeah. And so what's happened with my parents' Spanish is they start to use Mexican words in their Spanish. So then when they're speaking on the phone with their family here, they start to use the Spanish of the Mexicans, just words. And so I could hear the conversation. They're like, they'll repeat it. And then I'll be like, it's this, you're saying the word that they don't know. Because it's a word that in Spain, they didn't know. But my parents had learned it by living in the States and who they talked to. So the communication was easy. As far as speaking the language and communicating with people, it's interesting how it goes because, you know, we can talk about the race and everything of people. When growing up in church, we had the Spanish Mass and the English Mass. And when we were younger, we would tend to go to the Spanish Mass a lot more because, number one, the language, it's easier for them to understand the service in Spanish. But then we started not going there as more. And I always wondered why. But then it's one of those, like, it's when we think of not racism, but what makes you feel comfortable. When we'd go to church, we would stand out. And the people who know us, well, they know why we're there. But the people who didn't, then, well, why are they here? Well, because they speak Spanish. You know, you could feel that. And it was always so strange to me, but it's natural. And so then we started going to the English, but it was never a discussion. It was just like, well, we're just going to go at the 9:00 Mass versus the 11, which also for us, work-wise, for farming, it's better to go earlier than at 11. So it's a couple of factors. And I never asked my parents about it because it didn't bother me. So it was always interesting. And then as a Spanish teacher, I had a lot of Mexicans and kids. And that was always fun because we might argue. Here I am, the teacher, and they're like, well, that's wrong. I'm like, it's not wrong. It's different because the way you say it or your abuelita says it is different. It's not that I say it wrong. And the same thing would happen because a couple of the Spaniards, their kids were in my class and I taught a very universal Spanish, not just Castellano, even though I speak, yes, el Castellano, I teach Spanish, a very global. I like to know all these nuances, a lot like my dad. And our neighbors that were Spaniards, they'd always like, you're teaching our kids wrong. You're teaching them that Spanish. And I'm like, what Spanish? I'm teaching them Spanish. Right. I'm like, what I'm teaching them is a more well-rounded and global Spanish. So instead of knowing one word for beans, they learn all of these. Instead of learning one word for sheep, they learn more. I'm increasing their knowledge. Right. So it was, those things always mess with my brain because I'm like, the way people think and frustrating.
And I always think about Spanish too, because, and that's why I ask questions like that, because it's so vast and it's spoken in so many different countries. And there are the cultures that are attached to the language as it's spoken in Spain, Mexico, Ecuador, Chile, et cetera, et cetera. So it's natural that things would change. And I just always marvel at the vastness of Spanish and just how much it can change and how different it is. But I like that you have this universal Spanish that you're teaching and giving this well-rounded Spanish education to your students, because you never know where they may end up.
Exactly. Exactly. When I moved to Boise, a couple colleagues there, Spanish has 6 verb forms. One of the verb forms is used only by Spaniards, but not just Spaniards in Spain, Spaniards around the world. But it's also, that's kind of a little lie, because any Spanish person that goes to church in the Americas, when they go to church, in the Bible, in the sermon, they use the Castilian form.
Oh.
And I only know that because my Mexican friends, they told me. I didn't know. And I was like, So my colleagues, when I moved to Boise, they weren't teaching the sixth form, the you all form that we use in the Castilian Spanish. And their reasoning for it was, it doesn't serve our community because the majority are from Mexico. I'm like, okay, that's true. But according to my Mexican friends, if they go to church, they will hear it. And sure, a teenager might not listen to the sermon as well, but when they get older, they're going to be like, well, what's this form of the verb? What is this?
Right.
And my friend who told me this, she's a Spanish teacher. She was one of my colleagues as well, back home in Moses Lake. So that happens all over the United States. So many schools do that. They teach the Castilian or they don't. They just teach the 5 forms of the verb.
Okay.
So yeah, I feel like if we would teach more of a global for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That could help. Tell me about learning Basque. And, you had this exposure from a young age, but when was it that you decided that you were ready to learn? And what was that experience like when you started learning it?
Okay. So as a little girl, I said earlier, I really wanted to learn. And I would always ask my dad, show me, teach me. And he said, no, like I said earlier, no, in this country too. But when we learned to play cards, songs, I learned like numbers. I learned some simple basic things, and to play cards, I could do it. So in the back of that little girl's head, it was always this dream. I wanted to learn Basque. When I would come to visit my family in the Basque Country, or go, depending on which aspect I'm talking, my grandma, so grandma in Basque is a machi for the area we're from. And other areas will say a muma or mona. For us, it's a machi. And so when we'd go visit a machi, she'd always like, it's a shame that your dad didn't teach you Basque. Yeah, I know. It's a want of mine. I wanted to. So the dream was always there. It was there. Well, when here's me dating myself. I think it was around 94, 95 when the internet finally kicked in worldwide and I was at the university. Those were some of my first searches. Is I would look for how to learn Euskera. And one of the first websites, and he's a friend of mine now in the United States, he came out with the first complete Basque website, like it's an English website, but full of Basque information. And it's buber.net. And that's what I found, information on how to start learning Basque basics, etc. There was also a forum to connect with Basques. And so there was more. I can finally start to access this. Well, the dream kept going, dream going. It didn't happen until 2020. So I had moved from Moses Lake to Boise, Idaho. My dreams as a little girl were to move to the Basque Country, to come over here and teach, and to learn Basque. Well, I kind of forgot about those. They were here in the back of my head, but I wasn't doing much to pursue them. Mm-hmm. So when I moved to Moses Lake to Boise to teach, I started playing Basque pelota, la pelota vasca. That would take me to play in international tournaments. I would come to France and play in 2010 into the World Championships. Wow. And that's when I was like, I'm forgetting about my dream. And from there, on that same trip, it was a 3-week trip that I got out from school for this. So I was so fortunate. 2 weeks were in France. And then for 1 week, I would go to Durango in Vizcaya for another tournament. And it's right in the heart of the Basque Country. And I was like, yep, I got to make something happen. As soon as I go back to Boise, I'm going to go to the museum, the Basque Museum, and find out about classes. Returned, and it was literally around this time of year, just November, December. And I said, what do I got to do to start learning Basque? Well, we're already midway into the year, but if you want to join us, okay, thank you. So I did. And then I knew that summer as a teacher, I have my summers free. And I was like, I'm going to take my summers and go to the Basque Country to start learning Basque. So I asked my teacher there, who was from the Basque Country, Izaskun, and I said, well, they're called barnetegis. Do you know any barnetegis where I could go full intensive? And she said, yeah. So she helped me connect with them so the summer of 2011. That year, there was no lower levels at that barnetegi. There was level 5, which if you think about level 5 in a language, it is speaking in like, if you would do this, if you would have done that, conditionals. That's really high level.
B1, B2.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I'm at beginner with some, very small foundation, but very minimal. At least I know it. I heard the language. I wasn't coming in at 0. And she goes, what do you think? You brave enough to start there? I'm like, yeah, if there's no other option. So I went over to the Basque Country that summer. I did 2 months. And my teachers knew I knew Spanish, but my classmates never did. Because what happens when you go to these schools is you take breaks. You go to like 9 to 11, you have class. At 11, you all go to the local bars to have a coffee or a little pincho, a little snack. You come back to class from 11:30 to 1:30, then back to lunch, then class. There's always these breaks with your classmates. And that's your opportunity to speak always en Basque, because at this barnetegi and in Lascaux, the town knows that there's a lot of students that come in. So if they hear you in the bar, they actually help to say, Euskera, like you speak Basque here. And if I would have told my classmates I knew Spanish, every time we went out for coffee or drinks, they would have started talking to me in Spanish. Instead, they'd start to talk to me and I'd be like, find the verbs in my brain. And I'd be like looking for the verbs. Like it was torture, but there was a will. And when there's a will, there's a way. I was going to do it. And one day we were walking to the mountains, up to the top of the mountain, exercising. And usually it'd be 4 of us. My friend, she came over also to learn. And her and I were really, we were really good classmates because we knew we spoke English, but we would always try to speak to each other in Basque as well. Cause we were here, we were paying our way. It's expensive to fly over in the summer. The classes were not free for us. So we were really good. And on these walks, we also were always speaking in Basque. Well, one day she was gone. She was talking to her husband and it was me with the 2 guys. We're walking and they start talking in Spanish. They're like, I'm sick and tired of speaking Basque. Yeah, but poor Esther, she's not going to understand us. And I just said in Spanish to them, I go, tranquilos, chicos. I was like, hey, relax. I understand everything you're saying. And it was just like, mouth drop. Wait, you've been here for over a month and a half and you've never said you know Spanish? And I go, no. Why? I go, the way you talk to me would have been different. Of course. I go, bingo. I'm here to learn Basque, not to work on my Spanish.
Right.
So I would do that for the summer of 2011, 2012. I did another month and a half or 2 months. No, I've got to forget. 2 months, month and a half in 2012, 2013, a month and a half, 2014, a month. So I've only studied for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of official Spanish.
Right.
But I've always tried to instantly use it with the people in the community, with my family and friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So my studies are backwards. They're like top. I always wanted to go back to the bottom when they offered the low levels, and my teachers, they would never let me. It was frustrating because I'm like, my personality is very, I need to know every step. Like I'm very, like my degree's in bio and chemistry, even though I teach languages, and it's like, I need to understand everything, and they wouldn't let me go down. So instead they just kept moving me up.
Why do you think they wouldn't let you?
They said I knew enough. They're like, you just need to keep talking. Just keep talking.
Okay.
They felt I was fine. And on paper, I was actually better than most students, but it's also because I do teach languages. So I'm able to grasp the grammar. And then also they wanted me to just practice the speaking. And of course, how are you going to do that? Sticking with people that are a higher level than what I have. And even though I'm like, yeah, but I will be a good student at those lower levels, because I'm also going at it as a teacher mentality, that I'm not in there to just, pass easily. No, I'm there to learn.
Right.
And no, they wouldn't let me. 1 year, they let me go back down, but I was like at level 9 one of the summers, and they let me drop like to level 8. I was like, oh no, like level 2. Nope. No, they wouldn't. So, which helped, because I think I know I don't speak perfectly. I have a lot of gaps in my knowledge, but I know the word in Spanish. What's the word in English? Asimular. It's not like fake it till you make it type of deal, but it's like, I'm able to kind of, yes, fake my way through, where I understand a lot more than maybe I'm able to articulate. Because I can catch this, and I fill in the gaps. But then maybe when I go to speak, it's like I drop it down to my basic level, which I can get away with. So, yeah.
I really think that is great that your teachers pushed you to stay at a higher level, because I think so often we get the opposite of that advice, and people say, well, you can't go to a high, like you can't even think about it, touch it, look at it, because you don't know the very, very basics. And it doesn't work for everyone like that. And I think also because maybe you have the cultural connection to the language as well. So it's not like you were coming in totally at zero, because you'd been around it for
my whole life. Yeah.
Your whole life. So you definitely had that. As you were going through this process, and I'm asking this in realizing that I've heard many people say that Basque is difficult to learn. And I think it's difficult. And I have talked about Basque before on the show. I think it's difficult because of the grammar, and because it isn't really related to anything else. It isn't related to anything else. How was it to handle those kind of technical moments, where you did have to understand the grammar and break it down? And what was that experience like?
One of the things, like, like I've always heard my entire life, it was so difficult. It's so difficult, so difficult. And when I started learning, I was like, it's not that difficult. I honestly don't think it's that difficult. But what is difficult is that it's so completely different. And one of the things as humans is we don't like challenges. Not many people like challenges. We want easy.
Yes.
And if we have to work for it, or as soon as you hear that it's hard, you just, it's hard, So like I would always, my whole life, it's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. So I really believed it was so hard when I went into it. And then I was like, nah. I've even asked people now as an educator, I'm like, what stops you from learning Basque? It's just so hard. I'm like, oh, have you tried? Never tried. I'm like, how do you know it's so hard? You've just heard, So the hardest part for me was, and this is what I tell my students now, even though it's a Western world language, like English, we write from left to right. Like Spanish, left to right. However, in order to understand Basque, it is like the Eastern world. It is right to left. So many times when I'd start to write, of course, I write it in the order of left to right, like normal. That's how you write Basque. But the way you develop the sentence, everything is developed with the verb at the very end. And the verb carries the subject. So it's basically like, I read irakuridut. The T at the end is I. The do goes together with the read. So in English, we'd say, I read a book. In Euskera, liburu bat irakurtzen dut. Liburu is book, bat is a, Irakuri, do is read, and the T at the very end is I. But you write it left to right, but you understand it right to left.
Okay.
That is difficult for our brain to wrap around because it's completely the reverse. So many times I would write it and then I would have to erase it to put it in the right order, because I would write it in the order of, what do I have in my brain? English and Spanish. So I would do it in that direction very naturally because it's all I know. So if we think about probably most Basque learners, what do they know? They either know Spanish, they know French, or they know English. And what do? The same thing.
Right. Okay. Oh, I like that. My last guest that we talked about Basque with on the show, she told me about, and I hope I'm remembering the name right, but it's Auritz Taula. It's like
the verb chart.
Yeah.
And it's the Auritz Taula.
Auritz Taula. And as you're teaching the language, is this a tool that you use in your teaching?
The chart?
Yeah.
For beginners, not yet, because that chart for beginners, only 1, 2, 3 of the sections will be for beginners. It goes into, just because that chart goes into your past tenses, your conditionals. And what's quite fascinating is a big chunk of this, the majority right here that you can't see, but we can kind of, if you're looking at a piece of paper, everyone, and you look at probably more than a quarter of it, that's dedicated to one verb, the verb that we know in English as the verb can.
Yikes. Wow.
To be able to.
Oh,
it's
that's
one
so cool.
entire section is just can.
Huh.
Yeah. Quite fascinating.
How many ways are we using this verb? And what is the verb?
Well, the form of it is al. A-H-A-L. But where it's complicated with Euskera is that we always talk about a verb that has an object and a verb that doesn't. So, for example, I walk. That doesn't have an object. I walk myself. I walk the dog. Now there is an object. I'm walking the dog. But I walk myself. No. I read. What's the question? What do you read? I read a book. That's an object. I bake. What? So with the verb can, it's going to break down where you have can do things that, like, I can walk, I can run, I can not sleep, because that's sleep is odd because it's actually with an object. I sleep. Yeah. That all is with al y san. And then you have al, that's also with the verb ukan for objects. And then in that chart, it breaks down all the forms, the I, you, we, it, he, she doesn't, there's no he, she, it's just one form. There's no gender to it. And then the we, you all, and they. Similar to like Spanish has that breakdown of all the forms.
As I'm looking at the chart and you're walking me through it, and I'm thinking, like, is it time for me to learn Basque? Because even though I said the word daunting, I should have used the word exciting, because it's like, you know what I'm realizing too is, like, I always love puzzles, and I'm kind of leaning more into, like,
it's a puzzle,
figuring myself out these days. But I'm like, I love puzzles, and looking at that and how you're explaining how the language and the grammar works, I'm like, if I approach this as a puzzle, I could probably have a lot of fun learning Basque. And
for sure.
Yeah, I don't say that to diminish the language at all. Just
no.
In my process, just thinking, like, you know, look at it as a fun challenge for your brain. And
I think your analogy is excellent, because it's about finding the pieces that unite. Because what do we know about the Basque language? It is a language that declines, So it has these declinations, these endings, these suffixes we add to the end of a word. And you got to find the right piece depending on what you're talking about. And if you think about kind of like, yes, like Legos or something, which one are you going to put at the very end that's going to be the right connector?
Mm-hmm. I want to ask about Basque Country. I once went to San Sebastian in Spain, and it was one of my favorite places that I've been. I love it. I think it's beautiful. And I know that you are in France, but you're also in Basque Country, correct?
Yep.
So, and I guess, you know, as you've traveled back and forth and as you've lived in Europe, are there any things that you notice differently about the language of the Basque people in the modern Spanish borders versus in the French Basque Country? Like, how does the language change at
And
all
very,
between those two?
yeah. And it does. So one of the things is accents will vary because in the Spanish Basque Country, we call it Igualde, which is Ego means south. So it's the southern Basque Country. And then the France part of the Basque Country, we call that Iparralde, which is the northern part of the Basque Country. So you got Iparralde, which is the 3 in France, and then the 4 in Spain, Igualde. So that's the historical Basque Country. So in Igualde, in the Spanish side, what will happen is you will hear, if Basque speakers are speaking, like even just as last week, we were watching Basque Pelota on TV. I was on FaceTime with my parents and we were watching the same game and they were interviewing one of the pelotaris, the Basque players. They were speaking. And my dad was like, and why is he saying bueno? Bueno is not Basque. And he always picks up on when a Basque speaker throws in the Spanish. To him, it's like, it really le llama la atención. It calls attention to him, you know? He's always like, that's a Basque. And he's mixing. I'm like, really? Because you never mix your English with Spanish. No. And so that's what I know. So in Igualde, you'll hear that the use of Spanish words when, you know, maybe they forget one word. So all of a sudden it's a quick transition. There's a Spanish word that's inserted and then it's back to using Euskera, the Basque language. So it's quite fascinating. In Iparralde, it's the reverse because you will hear the French word that will pop in. If they don't know something, it's a French word. And everyone now in schools is learning the unified Basque, which is Batua. You know, it's the same way in schools. We learn English, but then what we speak outside of a school, based on our family situations, whatever our communities like, we speak a different form of the English. It might not be what's school, the educational, the academic form of language, but it's still English. Well, that happens with Euskera. What will also happen in Iparralde is because of French influence. In French, not in France, in the French language, we have one verb, to be, just like English, the verb être. Whereas in Spanish, we have 2 verbs, ser y estar. So Euskera has 2 verbs. It has izan, which is like ser, and it has egon, which is like estar. So for a Spanish speaker that's learning Euskera, it's very natural for them when they start to learn Euskera because, it's the same. Ser y estar, they understand it well. An American or not American, an English speaker, they could be Australian, British, it doesn't matter to me. Someone who only speaks English, they don't know other languages, and they go to learn Euskera, it's quite difficult for them because we're used to one verb in English, and now you have 2. Well, why do you distinguish between the 2? What's the difference between the 2? In France, that's what will happen is they might learn 2 in school with Batua, but speaking wise, they'll use 1.
Interesting.
Yeah. So And that's borrowed, from the other culture that they are living around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And
How?
just things like that, where other words, like I've been hiking in France, and they'll say words in Euskera. And I remember one day hiking in the mountains, and they're like, "Kashu, kashu, lancherosas de la." And I'm like, "Lancherosa, lancherosa." And I'm like, dangerous? Arriscuchua is in Basque, but they used a word like dangerosa, which is like dangerous, dangereux or something in French. But that's where we say that English and Spanish won't help, but it does, because remember, French or English is made of French words.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So by knowing English that has a root words that come from the French language, and if you're speaking Euskera, you might be lucky and be like, because of that, I can decipher it like I did. Or if you are in Igualde, then you know Spanish, it helps you also because of that. So when people are like, it doesn't help you to know either one. Yes, it does. The more languages you know, it helps you.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear about your teaching. And I guess maybe when did you decide that this was going to be the step for you to start teaching? And what are your students like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't decide. It was kind of decided for me. It was kind of a wow opportunity for me. So, like I said, I started, learning Euskera. And then when I moved from Boise to the Basque Country, the North American Basque organization offers Basque classes through their Euskara, through their Basque houses. And the coordinator at that time, a friend of mine, she was like, "Hey, we need teachers. Would you be interested in teaching one of them?" And you could do it online. They would be in Rockland, California, and I would be here in the Basque Country. And I was like, "Me? I can't do it." And she's like, "Why not?" I'm like, "Well, I don't, I haven't been." She's like, "Why can't you teach it?" She goes, "You're a teacher. You know how to teach." She's like, "And you know Basque. You can teach it." I'm like, "Well, of course I could. Yeah, of course." By then I'd been teaching for, 15, 16 years anyway. So it's just, but in mindset, it was like, I can't teach it. I'm a newbie in the language. And of course, so I was given the opportunity to teach it to the group in Rockland, California. And I did that in 2015, 2016, 2017. Then we took a break. And then last year, again, started back up with kind of a potpourri group it starts from Boise, the hub, and then any students that are pretty much like from East Coast, Texas, Midwest, and then did that last year and this year. So that I do for the Basque organization in the United States. And then for myself, been teaching in the classroom for now, this is my 24th year. And when I moved here is when I really started, even though I'm really techie, like I love using technology in the classroom, I didn't realize that people were actually doing business online. Like that never dawned on me, even though I use tech like crazy to use it in the classroom and stuff. And so when I moved here, I wasn't teaching the full-time schedule I was in the States. And I realized that there are people teaching online. And I started to discover them like on Instagram. And I wasn't not looking at Basque. I was like, wow, they're teaching English and Spanish. What? Oh my gosh. Like there's this whole world. And I like challenges. That's what I know about myself is I don't like easy. I like difficult. And my brain started to go like this in 2015, like, well, why can't I do this? Why can't I start to offer Basque classes and create courses and do this now, maybe leave the classroom? This would be my new challenge.
Oh.
But I was like, for all of a sudden, like, I don't know what happens. Like, I've never been afraid of stuff, but as I'm getting older, I'm starting to become more of a little chicken. I don't know why, you get more cautious.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? I can't change after all these years. So I just wasted like 2015, 16, 17, 18, 4 years of wasted of just spying on people, just being a lurker going, oh, I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. And, and meanwhile, my idea is just kicking and wasting a lot of time scrolling, just researching. And so finally I said, 2019 is when I was like, stop. You've got to, like, you've wasted how many years of your life? Like, this obviously is something you want to do. And what I know about students worldwide, what we offer, through the Basque Museum, or not through the museum, but through the North American Basque Organization and all the other different Basque houses around the world, which comes through subsidies from the Basque government as well. So we are very grateful to the Basque government because they do help to provide money to ensure that the Basque language is being taught even outside of the Basque Country.
Right.
But I realize a lot of people don't go to these classes. Why? I don't know, but it could be anything. The time schedule doesn't fit, or I don't want to go to classes there, or they're not available to go to classes there because they live 10 hours away, And by having something that they could get and complete on their own with maybe a community aspect, that's what I had as my vision. So in 2019, that's when I bought my first course, how to learn how to navigate to online. I don't need help teaching. It's the business aspect of everything. What do I even do? And learning about all the business of online. And that's what I started doing, is creating stuff and just building, a community behind that, is trying to teach, trying to show people that how important it is to learn Basque. Like, sure, you don't need Basque, but why wouldn't you want to learn it? It's an isolate language. It's something unique. It's mysterious because we still don't know, like, how has it continued to survive for so many years? And it's still here. It's thriving, but it should continue to thrive. And when we look at the word Basque, what it means to be Basque, when you translate that to the Basque language, it's Euskalduna. And the definition of Euskalduna means the one who can Basque, which means the one who can speak Basque. Oh. And so for me, as a girl who grew up, very strong identity of being Basque, but not speaking the language, that never felt right to me. If I want to identify as being Basque, I want to speak the language. And I really want to compel people to recognize that, like, if you want to call yourself a Basque, then learn the language, because that's the definition of the word.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying you have to get up to C1 and be fluent, but try to learn some of it, have a basic understanding, be able to be like, say, ongi, basics. That goes a long way. It'd be like saying, I'm an American and I don't speak English. Mm-hmm. How do we feel about that? Many Americans don't go for that, right? You need to speak English. And that's how just the definition of Basque says that. And that's why it's more than a race. Like, the Basque is not even just a race. It's the one who can speak Basque. And as a little girl, my dad taught me that. He goes, you'll see one day in the Basque Country, you will see people that are Chinese speaking Basque. You will see Black people speaking Basque. And it's true, because it's not a race. It's someone who can speak the language. Right. And that's what I want to do I want people to learn the language.
Yeah. Well, you've already got me on board.
Hey.
I'm like, how am I going to fit all of these things into my plans? But I kind of told myself, you know what, I'm not pushing myself to try to be fluent in any other languages, but I do want to,
dabble. And
I think even dabble is maybe too much. But I do want to just dabble lightly. Let's say that. into so many other languages. Before I forget, please let us know about your courses, and let us know about your podcast and your business and everything that you're up to, and how we can get in touch with you if we want to.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share. So you can find me on Instagram. That's where I started doing most things. And to be completely transparent, I hate social media. I hate social media. It's always been keep track of my friends. And so when I started on this online business journey, it's been really hard for me. And it's out of my comfort zone, not because I'm shy, I'm reserved. And I don't care to get the likes. Like that's never what I've been about. And I don't compete with others. Like I compete with myself. And so there's this world on social media that just sometimes really annoys me because it's about, I've got thousands, millions of followers. Great. I want legit people. Like, and if it's one legit to me, that's so important. Like that's gold. So you'll find me there and I'm trying my best because I know that's the world we're living in, to connect with people. So you can find me at Basque and Languages on Instagram and Esther Segunda. And then on Facebook as well, Esther Segundas. And I have the page and there's a group I have for new Basque speakers. And that's my whole plan is I want to create a membership. I interviewed people to see, what do you guys want? What do you want? What's your idea? So I'll be launching that in 2022. And it's the New Basque Speaker Club because, like I said earlier, Euskaldun means a Basque speaker. But we also distinguish between a new Basque speaker and an old Basque speaker, not by age, but like old. So we say Euskaldun Sarra, old Basque speaker, native. Or like myself, I'm an Euskaldun Berri, which is I'm a new Basque speaker. I've learned the language. It wasn't my first language. So I'm creating that. So I have the free Facebook group where I try to just get them engaging and asking questions like, what's your favorite Basque fruit? Simple things like that. And I do it in English and in Basque for them. You can find me on there. Then on my website, estersegunda.com. And I have a free mini course. I've created like a Quizlet set, like a frequent words you can find. And I just released, this is where I'm crazy. I'm a workaholic. And Monday, an idea popped in to my head. So when you're listening to this, it will be later on. This will be old, but I created a challenge because this is what I want to do in my membership is create, yes, your vocab that you can learn. Yes, you can have your grammar, but maybe I only got 5 minutes I can do a day or 2 minutes. Well, there'll be monthly challenges every month where there'll be like little tidbits of things you can do. Maybe it's one word of the day and that's it. Listen to this song, but how can you incorporate the language in your day? So that's what I did for this holiday season is I created a challenge and released it into the world. So that's available. And then the mini Basque course, which is, let's focus on the Basque culture, basics, numbers, and food, which is important because of the gastronomy and the cuisine in the Basque Country is top notch. So that's where you can find me. And then my podcast related to immigration is called The Immigrant All Around. And brand new. I launched it last year and it's going to be a slow moving project because it's a lot of work for me with everything else I've got. And I interview immigrants and try to get their stories. And I want to have their stories saved. So we'll have those. So the first stories were my mom and dad. The third one was my aunt who immigrated to Argentina. And I interviewed her this year in 2021 in January, and she passed away this spring.
Oh no.
But I had her episode to release and her kids were like, that was the best present you have. And I've interviewed another gentleman that I'm trying to edit his episode and he's passed away as well. But we have their stories and their family will have that episode to say, in their memory. So if they ever want to listen to the voice of their loved one, it's there. They'll have it. And so as a daughter of immigrants, I love immigrant stories. I love the struggle, what they've gone through, their experiences. And that's why that project for me is important. Like if I could cut myself in half, in probably about 5 pieces, one piece would only focus on doing that. Like you're doing with your podcast. Like I love it. I commend you. And I wish I could just dedicate only to that. That's my problem is too many things always. So that's what got going on there for languages, for the immigrant. And then my other podcast, which is a kind of a motivational about teaching, launching, business, productivity, etc. And that's called Teach, Launch, Create. So that's where you can find me.
Great.
Yeah.
I will add the links to everything in the show notes for this episode so that
Thanks.
people who are looking to get in touch with you can just do so at the click of a button. Well,
Yep.
Esther, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yes.
Escarigasco, my
Uh-huh.
my one Basque word that I learned in the Basque Country. I like to.
I've got one expression that I want to share with you.
Oh yeah. Maybe it could be an answer to this question. My last question, which is, do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Basque or Spanish to share?
Well, that's the one I want to share with you. The one that I love when I learned this from a friend, and it happens when someone sneezes. And the first time I heard it, I was like, I like that. And to this day, it's something, and I want people to know this because it's really, you know, when someone sneezes in English, what do we say?
Bless you.
Bless you. Or someone might say it in German. Oh, they say Gesundheit.
Gesundheit.
Well, Euskera, if you were to sneeze, I would say to you, Eun urtes. Like, happy 100 years to you, 100 years to you. And you would respond to me, Eta su contalari. And you're going to count them. So the message behind that is saying, I'm wishing you 100 years. And then you're saying it to me and you're going to be there to count them with me.
Oh my heavens.
And I love it.
To
love me, like that one's like, so eun urtes eta su contalari.
Okay, I want to try it, but I'm gonna repeat after you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready.
Eun urtes.
Eun urtes.
Eta su contalari.
Contalari.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
So eun urtes.
Eun urtes.
Eta su contalari.
Eta su contalari.
Orida. Osundo. Yes.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That might be one of my favorite ones that someone has answered to this question.
Yeah. When someone saw, and I was like, I love that. And that to me is always something I want to wish, because there's some really cool words in Basque because it's such a compound language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like one of my favorite words is basa mortua, which means desert. But literally, basa means forest and mortu means dead. Basa mortu, dead forest, the desert. There's many words like that. But that expression of how we say, like, bless you, but eun urtes eta su contalari, like that to me is even more powerful than anything I've ever heard. Because it's like you're wishing someone many years of life, and then they're wishing it back that you'll be there to count them with me.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
It makes me think of like my best friends, you know,
exactly.
And like I really, really love that. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Esther.
Yeah. Eso regatik.
Before I let you go, don't think about this, but we've been having a really lovely chat for quite some time. So in this situation, when two Basque speakers are parting ways, what is the best way to say goodbye?
Lasterarte.
Lasterarte?
Mm-hmm.
Lasterarte.
Lasterarte. Uh-huh. Icusarte.
Icursarte.
Uh-huh. Icusarte. And ayo.
Ayo.
Uh-huh. That one's really informal, more of a bye.
Oh, I love it.
The other two are lasterarte, see you soon. Icusarte, until we see each other again.
Oh, thank you so much. Icusarte, Esther.
Icusarte.
Thanks again, and I'll be talking to you soon. Bye.
Icusarte.
Icusarte.